Hello and welcome to the 007 Files, a podcast where we open up the filing cabinet drawers and look at every and any aspect of our favorite fictional spy, Bond, James Bond. I'm co-host Javi Trujillo, and joining me today is one of my fellow 00s, Bill Koenig. How are you today, Bill?
I'm doing fine. Thanks, Javi.
Well, in this installment, we are very excited to welcome author Kim Sherwood to the show. Her latest book in the 00 trilogy, Hurricane Room, just launched across the world in May, and we are delighted that she was able to give us some of her time today. So thank you for joining us, Kim. How do you do?
Thanks so much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Well, as we begin, I've got a few icebreaker questions for you so the listeners can get to know your fandom. These can be as rapid fire as you like. How were you first introduced to James Bond, and what cemented your fandom?
I think my first introduction, like many people, was the film. So it was seeing Pierce Brosnan on the TV. I was too young to go to see him in the cinema until Die Another Day. What cemented my fandom, well, I loved the films, but it was probably reading Ian Fleming. I first read Fleming when I was 12, From Russia with Love, and really fell in love with his writing. I mean, a lot of it obviously went over my head at age 12, geopolitically and everything else.
Yeah.
But I just loved his style so much. And I think that was what made me a Bond fan forever.
I definitely remember being around that age and starting to read Fleming as well. And like for me, and I understand how affectionate people are for that book, but I was always waiting to get to Bond, and there's a third of that book is not about Bond. And so I always gravitated more towards Goldfinger because of that.
And that had such a brilliant opening as well, Goldfinger, sitting in the airport contemplating death. It's a much more melancholy novel, much more melancholy writer, really, than we get in the films.
Oh, completely. Yeah. There's almost like two Bonds, as it were.
Yeah.
Well, and people who analyze Fleming kind of put Goldfinger, the novel, as kind of a inflection point. And if you kind of look at it compared to what was going on in Fleming's life, particularly health-wise,
yeah,
you know, so like the early novels, they're not perky, but they're not necessarily as melancholy.
Yeah, absolutely. Not as focused on death. I think Goldfinger really has death at the heart of it, as perhaps he was facing his own ill health and, as you say, the sort of turning point in his life.
Who's your favorite James Bond?
Pierce Brosnan. I think for a lot of people, it's who you grew up with. For me, it was Brosnan. He has the perfect mixture of being charming and suave and funny, but also cold and ruthless. And for me, that is Fleming's Bond, and it's the right cocktail of those different facets of the character.
Yeah, I feel like he combines the literary elements with what we've seen with Connery and Moore. And while I was a Bond fan before then, like I was 18 when GoldenEye came out, and just leading up to that, like that was it was cementing for me.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Who's your favorite Bond girl?
Oh, what a good question. In the novels, it would be Darla Brand, Moonraker, because she has her own mission. She's a secret agent as well. She's just such a capable and commanding character. I love her. Of course, she doesn't really make it to the screen adaptation. So on screen, who would be my favorite? That's really tricky. And I don't think anybody has ever asked me that, which is amazing after 5 years. I think probably I'm torn between a few, but I'm going to go with Pussy Galore because I think she has some of the best retorts and one-liners of any of the female characters.
She is great. What are your favorite film and novel?
My favorite novel is From Russia with Love because it was my first, and my favorite film is actually the same. For me, From Russia with Love cinematically cements the Bond recipe. You know, we're getting all of the different parts coming in, and it's so perfect, and it's a bit Hitchcock, but it's not too much that. It's also its own style, and I think Connery kind of nails his performance, or really crystallizes his performance in that film. So that's my number one, but with GoldenEye as a very close number two.
Excellent. So GoldenEye being your favorite Pierce then?
Yeah, for sure. Although I have a soft spot for Die Another Day, I realize that it's not the not the best film in the oeuvre, we could say, but it is the one I saw in the cinema, and I think that leaves a big impression.
I wrote an article for the James Bond dossier, which is our other co-host's website, David Lee, defending Die Another Day.
Excellent.
It's not perfect, and I can't defend the parasailing. Yeah, it's very good, and I see hints of it in Hurricane Room, which we're going to get to.
Well, the first hour of Die Another Day is a de facto adaptation of the Moonraker novel. Because the villain appears to die, and then he comes back, in disguise with that whatever that DNA thing was. But that mimics, Drax in the Moonraker, where he was a Nazi, and then he's like suddenly he resurfaces as this industrialist and businessman, and that's what Gustav Graves appears to be.
Yes. Minus the Hitler stuff. Yeah.
Right, and of course they actually worked blades into the movie. Yeah. So
and I love that sequence.
Looking at that great shelf behind you, do you have a favorite piece of memorabilia?
Good question. So I think it would be my Fleming first editions. I have a few, which you can see behind me. And I was just given 2 more, actually, by a very, very kindly man called Ian in the signing queue at the Waterstones Piccadilly launch for the book. He just brought 2 Fleming first editions along. I can show you them. They're just here on my desk. So he brought me The Spy Who Loved Me and Octopussy and the Living Daylights, these really beautiful ones that look like...
Oh, wow. This chopping
wood
covers.
Engravings. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm so thrilled and touched. It's really amazing.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And finally, on the Getting to Know You score, do you have a favorite song or score from one of the films?
Good question. I think Nobody Does It Better. Just such a beautiful love song. That would be my favorite. Or like a big Shirley Bassey number, or Tom Jones. I love the ones that are big and epic. But at the moment, I think it's Nobody Does It Better.
Have you heard the Amy Mann version that was on David Arnold's Shaken and Stirred?
No, I haven't.
I really love her cover.
I'll look that up.
Yeah. What do you think of the First Light song? Have you had a chance to listen to that at all?
I haven't. First Light came out. When did it come out? On the weekend or Thursday? Yeah. So halfway through my book tour. So I know that it exists in the world. that is all I know. I haven't been able to engage with any of it. But I'm excited. Too. And people have been messaging me who are playing it and giving me updates. And it sounds really cool.
It's been a lot of fun so far.
Yeah.
But if you'll take us back to the beginning of your journey, how did Double or Nothing come about? And was it always a trilogy from the start?
It was always a trilogy. So I was commissioned by the Fleming family with just 2 criteria: to expand the 00 section, so to introduce new 00 agents who could be heroes in and of their own right alongside Bond, and then also to update it into the modern day, whereas largely the continuation novels have been period, or at least recently they have been. But how I kind of went about that was really up to me, which was both really exciting and quite daunting because it was taking the whole franchise in a new direction. Mm-hmm. My sort of solution to that was to have Bond missing in Double or Nothing. He's gone missing on a mission. MI6 don't know if he's been captured or killed. And then we have these new 00 agents that he has had relationships with. Harwood, who's been his lover, Sid Bashir, who he's mentored, Hothrop Vane, who's intensely jealous of him, Dryden, who sort of sees him as a handsome security risk. They're trying to find him while also in Double or Nothing trying to avert a climate catastrophe. And then in A Spy Like Me, they sort of inch unexpectedly closer to him. So Hurricane Room is the first in the trilogy where he's alive and he's back. So it was my first chance to write him in the now. He'd appeared in flashbacks and in memory. So that's been really exciting. The actual call to write the trilogy, I really didn't believe. It felt like such a dream come true. It felt like a hoax when my agent called me. My agent called me and said the Fleming family would like to talk to you about writing Bond. And I've been saying to literally anybody who'd listen all my life, I want to write James Bond one day. And the appropriate response to that really is to laugh, because it's such an outlandish dream. But, it's a good lesson that sometimes it's worth saying outlandish things out loud, because the right people might hear you.
I was wondering if you could walk us through some of those character names of the double O's. I mean, Joanna Harwood is very obvious, but I've never heard you explain your choices. For that. Yeah.
So people who are listening to this podcast will know that Joanna Harwood is, of course, the name of the first woman to write Bond. She was the co-screenwriter on the first two films. And I really wanted to pay homage to her with 003, who is I guess we could say, the first female 00 to be a main character rather than a supporting character. And I wanted to go back to the real Joanna Harwood as a way to say thanks to her and her whole generation. Because if they hadn't fought those battles in the 50s and 60s and kind of smashed up against the glass ceiling, then I wouldn't be here now, and there wouldn't have been all these brilliant creative women in the world of Bond who often go kind of unsung or uncredited. Also felt quite personal in some ways, because my grandmother was a set and costume designer, Julia Squires, in that era, and fought a lot of those battles herself, and would have actually won an Oscar for Moulin Rouge, but they gave the Oscar to her male subordinate because they didn't want to give it to a woman at the time.
Wow.
So I felt like I wanted to kind of recognize that whole generation and the battles that they'd gone through. So I wrote to the real Joanna Harwood. He's now in her 90s and, lives on a yacht because she has the life that we really would want a Bond girl to have. So I wrote to her and said, would it be okay if I borrowed your name? And she sent me back this letter. I treasure it so much. She sent me back this pros and cons list, like reasons to say yes to using her name and reasons to say no to using her name. And there was one more yes than there was no. And that was that I had handwritten my letter to her rather than send her an email or anything like that. So the last thing was, you handwrote your letter. So yes, you can use my name. So then I was glad that I have a love of stationery and nice pens. So we have 003, Joanna Harwood. The other names came about in different ways. Some of them are straight from Fleming, so 000 or 000, Comrade Harthrop Vane. That's a surname that appears in a list that Fleming gives of other 00s. And there's a few others as well, Savarin and a few others that I mentioned that I've taken from Fleming. Then there's a few characters that Fleming mentions in passing. Like we have the kind of Russian defector who we're told dies in a bathtub in From Russia with Love. He in Sydney. He becomes a central, not central character, I suppose, but he and his wife, Anna, become a running subplot through the trilogy. So little bits I was taking from Fleming, and then some of them I was naming because I was trying to nod to the world that they're from. So Joseph Dryden, for example, it's a really common surname in the Caribbean, and also, of course, a classic English poet. And I wanted to nod to those two sides of his heritage. And then Sid Bashir is me being very geeky, and is a reference to Deep Space Nine, where we have Dr. Bashir, who in one of the holodeck episodes pretends to be Bond. And I loved that so much when I was a kid.
I think the episode title was Our Man Bashir,
Yeah,
which also evokes the 1966 movie Our Man Flint.
Yes, of course, yeah. And so superbly done. I always thought he would have been a great Bond. And he does it brilliantly in that episode.
Yeah, Deep Space Nine and Voyager were kind of like a dark area for me, because I was exiting high school, going through college, I didn't really have a lot of time for TV. But I have seen that episode, and I'm up to season 2 trying to watch Deep Space Nine now. But
excellent.
The second I heard that name, I'm like, that's got to be a nod to Dr. Bashir. And I love that character, and I was sad to see what happened to him. But who was your favorite 00 to write for, and what feedback did you get from fans on the first 2 books?
Good question. I think my favorite to write for is probably Harwood, because she maybe has the most complex or contradictory inner world. She's been in love with Bond and in love with Bashir, 2 very opposite men. She has these opposing selves. She's trained as a surgeon and taken the Hippocratic Oath. And then she's joined the 00 section and she's taken up a license to kill. So she has these sort of opposing values. Her skill is adaptability and camouflage and being anything that the person opposite her needs her to be. But that often leads to losing herself. And so she has this kind of driving question of who am I, and am I lovable for who I really am? And does anybody know who I really am? Mm-hmm. And that has provided a lot of material, particularly now in Hurricane Room, but across the trilogy, for just some really interesting character exploration. Feedback from the Flemings on the characters, they were so encouraging every step of the way. Really, they would just say, we've chosen you for your vision, and we want you to feel free to invent and to develop. So they really were really encouraging, gave me a lot of confidence to kind of take characters in new directions. I also talked to a lot of people for research that proved really valuable. So for Joseph Dryden, 004, who was a Special Forces soldier, and then he goes through a traumatic brain injury in Afghanistan that affects his hearing. I talked to a couple of military doctors, these lieutenant colonels really high up. They were so generous with their time. It gave me a whole afternoon. And I kind of presented him like a case, like a medical case. And they talked me through as if he were completely real, as if he were their patient. They talked me through what would happen from the moment of injury to the moment of being recruited by MI6, which is a very sort of common recruitment path for former Special Forces soldiers. And that really unlocked the character for me and his contested relationship with his own body, which he's always been able to rely on as a warrior, and then changes suddenly as he loses his hearing, which the Q section then augments, and he has this kind of neural link to Q. And that conversation with those doctors was such a turning point in the writing. I was really grateful for that.
Harwood, I would say, is probably my favorite of your characters.
Thanks.
But I really love Dryden as well. And there was a moment in A Spy Like Me where I had to DM David Lowbridge Ellis, and I'm like, please tell me he's okay, because I know that you know Kim, and she wouldn't do this to you, would she? I was that apprehensive about it. So
yeah, he messaged me saying, "Don't tell me this is real," in the scene where something terrible appears to have happened. But I said to him, "Do you really want spoilers?" And he was like, "No, I'll just keep reading."
Which I think is a sign that you're doing something right when we get that concern midway through the book. Personally, I can't help but picture certain actors as I read. And as you're writing, do you see anyone in particular when it comes to Bond or Moneypenny or Leiter?
Good question. I think with Hurricane Room, because it was Bond, there's 2 different Bonds that we get in the novel. So I thought a lot about what can I bring to the table that's new for this character, and who is my Bond? What do I love about this character? What's my take on this character? So what I've done in Hurricane Room is to split him in 2. So we meet him in his mid-20s before he's become a 00, and he's attached to the British Embassy in Moscow as a sort of legal spy in the early 2000s. And we meet him in his mid-40s after Harwood has dragged him out of this brutal captivity, where he's no longer sure if he can trust her or his team or himself, and he's a tarnished man. what I was hoping to achieve there is the beginning and the end, whereas with Bond, we usually get all middle.
Mm-hmm.
So we usually have him in Fleming sort of vaguely kind of mid-30s, like never quite to 45, because that's the mandatory age of retirement for double O's. Fleming says if they're not dead yet, or they're expected to be dead. And then in the films, I think we're supposed to suspend disbelief, and we're supposed to believe that the actors never really age, until Daniel Craig anyway, when time is introduced. But, with Roger Moore, we're just supposed to believe that he's remained the same age as his co-stars, and that it's not increasingly creepy as the decades go on. So because of that, because I was writing this beginning and end Bond, none of the actors were quite the right age or acting quite the right age to fit into them. But I would have different flashes, so I would think of Brosnan's smile, or I would think of Roger Moore raising his eyebrow, or I would think of Sean Connery's walk, that very panther-like stalk that he has.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's in the audience's mind as well. And as a writer, you want to harness that cultural unconscious. It's a really powerful thing that we all share the same language when it comes to Bond. And you want to refer to those gestures and bring them into the text, whether it's him fixing his tie, or the way he holds a glass with a hand in a pocket, or something like that. With the others, Felix Leiter and Moneypenny. With Moneypenny, I was thinking more about Fleming's description. He describes her as having direct, quizzical eyes.
Mm-hmm.
I love that as a description of a woman with authority, because she's the longest lasting woman in Bond's life and the longest serving woman for us culturally in the Bond universe. And she has a lot of authority, and literally so in my series, because I've made her chief of the 00 section. And I love that her eyes are direct and quizzical, that she's in control, but she's also sort of laughing at you at the same time. So there's like some mischief there. There's power there. I love that about her. So I thought about that a lot. Leiter, again, I would go back to Fleming, because Fleming describes him as a hawk. He describes him as a knife, as a blade. There's something very kind of lean and cut away about Leiter. Loose in his clothes. And I really wanted to capture that in Hurricane Room, particularly where he's really been through the wars. I mean, as Leiter always does, Leiter's like never not in the wars. But in this one, he's gone through it again.
Just to follow up on that, in general, what was your approach with Fleming legacy characters, I'll call them? And I was wondering about a couple others. One, Tiger Tanaka showed up in the first book, and Bill Tanner.
Yeah. So we have a few. We have Tiger Tanaka, we have Rennie Mathis. We have these characters that I think of as Bond's family. Some of them as sort of surrogate father figures, particularly M, although my M is a new version of M. And for him, actually, I cast Patrick Stewart mentally. So if he's ever interested, that one's written for him. But with the legacy characters, it was a way in Double or Nothing and A Spy Like Me, it was a way to bring Bond in without him being there. Because you could have characters like Draco or Tanaka or Mathis speak about the part of Bond that they know and love. And it's all different aspects to his character. So it was ways to kind of build him into the story, these different facets of this very complicated man, without him being there. And then in Hurricane Room, that sets up some hopefully kind of impactful emotional moments where we have Bond's return and we have these men who love him and have missed him and want him back.
And Bill, your memory is better than mine. Lois Maxwell gave an interview about either when Timothy Dalton was starting or Brosnan was starting, and how Bond would come into the room and then in M's office, and she would turn around and be the new M, that Moneypenny had elevated herself. Do you remember which actor that was from?
The main thing I remember about Lois Maxwell, she was describing when she was first cast as Moneypenny. And she said in an interview that she and Connery had a discussion because, the script doesn't have a whole lot of detail. And they kind of concocted a scenario where they had once been lovers, and they kind of knew it wasn't going to work out, but they obviously remained on good terms. And so she described that in some detail. That's the thing I remember. Now that you mentioned the thing about, that sounds like something I probably did hear, but I don't remember the details. Specifically which Bond actor it was.
Kim, did you ever hear that quote?
No, it's really fascinating to hear that, though, because you can really see, I think, her influence on the role over the decades.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that interpretation that she and Connery came to of the relationship. I hadn't heard that before, but that's the way I've always felt about them, that they have the understanding of ex-lovers who've remained best friends. And for me, Moneypenny is Bond's home. I think he's often thought of as this quite lone character because he's out on the missions away from MI6, but it's coming back to Moneypenny's office. I think that's his homecoming. That's where he's safe. He leaves from there. He comes back to there. And that was something that I really wanted to develop with Hurricane Room, where his and Moneypenny's relationship is both in these flashback sections in their 20s, when they're kind of coming up as stars of the department together. And in the now, when they perhaps know each other better than anybody else because they've seen that growth and they've been there side by side and they have that trust, which I think is really interesting for a character who otherwise is quite isolated, both Bond and Moneypenny, actually.
Did you take any inspiration from the Naomi Harris iteration where she was the field operative, and she's been given so much prominence since Skyfall?
Yeah, for sure. A little bit in that she, as you say, she's a field operative, so she's away from the office. She's away from that kind of static site. And in Hurricane Room, when we first meet Moneypenny, she's acting as Bond's agent runner in the field. So she's in Moscow with him. And they're both at the embassy together, sort of trying to crack this case of far-right bombings across Europe. So I tried to give her a bit more agency there. And then in the now, people who read A Spy Like Me will know that at the end she's taken captive by Hearthrop Vane. And she, in this novel, is having to really rely on her wit and her sense of command and her capacity to recruit others to survive and get through this ordeal.
Forgive me, I do have a follow-up to my previous question. What is it about Bill Tanner? It's like people, the movies have trouble with him, because in the books, Tanner is supposed to be like the closest thing Bond has to a best friend. They would go to lunch together sometimes.
Canteen buddies.
Yeah, in the movies, I guess he's in The Man with the Golden Gun. He's not named. They just say he's the chief of staff, and it's a one scene role. For Your Eyes Only, James Villiers, I think was the actor's name. He seems to play Tanner very stuffily. And that doesn't ring true to Bill Tanner for me. I thought Michael Kitchen in his two movies in the Brosnan era was the closest, in my opinion, who sort of got the relationship. Rory Kinnear is a good actor, but he just seems to be a guy named Bill Tanner. He doesn't seem to evoke the friendship or semi-friendship of the novels. What? And also, there was a draft of Spectre where they made Tanner the traitor, and he commits suicide while Bond watches him. And it's like, what is it with Bill Tanner that what did Bill Tanner ever do to you?
I think it's probably a mixture of factors. One, I think, is that creatively, the idea of Bond having a best friend or a male best friend, if we're setting aside Moneypenny as his confidant as well, we have both Leiter and Tanner, and functionally that doubles up. So it's creatively, it's not very useful. Leiter can be out in the field with him, so he's more dynamic in the terms of story than Tanner is. So I could see why screenwriters would go with lighter more than Tanner and sort of make Tanner part of the furniture of the MI6 base, which is maybe underserving the character, but he becomes sort of a familiar face at MI6 rather than the close friendship that Fleming writes. I also wonder if he's a little bit undefined in terms of background, whereas Leiter has this background as a Marine, which is quite exciting, and a CIA agent, and then a Pinkerton detective in the novel. So again, is maybe just a bit more dynamic as an ally and a sort of sidekick. For me, my problem with Tanner is not Tanner at all himself. I always liked his character, but I do put him through the ringer. But for me, creatively, he was a way to think about the old boys network and the idea of blind spots within the establishment, that we're told to trust people because they went to a certain school, they belong to a certain club. This very British idea, which I wanted to question kind of as a part of a broader questioning of patriotism as a whole, I think, which is something that Fleming starts in Casino Royale. You know, in 1952, he writes, this idea of my country, right or wrong, is beginning to seem a little old-fashioned. So it's always been there. But I think particularly the films could lean on patriotism as a motive for the characters. And we have, you know, the Union Jack parachute and all of these kind of symbols of Britishness. But if you're writing a spy now in the 2020s, the idea of patriotism and belief in the system feels quite strained and incredulous. So Tanner was a way symbolically to tackle that, which isn't Tanner's fault, poor man, but it does come a bit down on his head.
And I will say that, you know, without spoiling anything, there is more for Bill Tanner and where his loyalties lie and what happened in Hurricane Room, which I like that that you circle back to that in the third book. I
absolutely, and
that.
we have Bond's utter disbelief of what he's being told, which I think speaks to the depth of their love for each other and friendship.
Yeah. I was hoping you could share a little bit about what your outline process is like. Like, how do you juggle so many different characters and pace out like their individual plot threads?
Very chaotically. I wish I could tell you that I have a very neat and beautiful system, but I don't at all. I think my natural creative process is to set threads running and then see where the characters take me. And that comes from, you know, my previous novels, which are sort of literary historical fiction, where I could take, you know, up to a decade to write them. It's fine just to set a character running and follow them and end up chopping out 40,000 words once you've found the shape of the narrative. For these novels, because I was trying to deliver a book a year, I was always in battle with myself about wanting to set the characters running and see where they would take me, and knowing that I needed a stricter outline and I needed to control the narrative so that it didn't run away from me and I could deliver the book on time. The way that I kind of answered that was to just think very visually. So I'm a very kind of visual planner. And I would get a very big roll of lining paper for wallpaper, you know, just a big blank sheet, and roll it out across my study floor and write down a timeline for each character and what they're doing and how they map onto each other. But I'd be prepared to change it all the time. So I wasn't doing it in advance. I was kind of doing it as I was writing, but a way to keep track of the characters and keep track of how their different adventures would knock onto each other and impact each other. Particularly with A Spy Like Me, where I have a lot of events that had to coincide exactly in different time zones, which ended up being a huge headache. And at the end of that novel, I said, nobody ever let me write a book about space and time again. Because that was fiendish. Fun, but fiendish.
Did you do any traveling for Hurricane Room? Because the novel goes all over the world. And I know you got behind the wheel of an Alpine for Double or Nothing. Like, what kind of fun research did you get to do for Hurricane Room?
Yeah, I did. So for Double or Nothing, I was taken out by a race car driver in the Alpine. And then in A Spy Like Me, They invited me down to Thruxton racetrack and they taught me how to drive. I've never driven a car before in my life, and they let me get behind the wheel of a sports car, which was, very dangerous to all involved. But they cleared the area. I couldn't hit anyone, and that was so much fun. It was amazing. With Hurricane Rim, so some of the traveling was actually in my past and was drawn on from memory. So the section that's written in Moscow in 2004. I actually went on a school trip to Russia around that time, amazingly. The government, I went to a state school, but the government subsidized this trip for us to go to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And it was such a formative time. I was about 17 maybe. And I'd never really experienced a culture that was that different in some ways. So that really stayed with me. And the hotel actually that the novel opens in, the Hotel Cosmos, is where we stayed, and it's this really famous space race aged hotel, which has in the basement Russia's so-called first professional strip club and is essentially a brothel. But our school obviously didn't realize that when they were making the booking. So we arrived at this hotel, bunch of 17-year-old girls, took one look around the lobby. It's very, very obvious. And the teachers were saying to us, "You are not to go in the basement." It was so scary. So that stayed in my mind, and that's the opening of the novel. And then other places, I would either be drawing on places I'd been or places where I could talk to people. So my dad was actually a production and tour manager for rock and roll bands, so has been anywhere in the world that music is played. So the sections in Lake Baikal, which seems too remote for anything. He'd actually been there and stood on the frozen lake, and I was able to ask him for, those sensory details that really help something come to life. So it's always a mixture of places I've been, places I can get to, and then if I can't, trying to talk to people who've been there and trying to get those details.
We've touched on this a little bit, but what aspects of Fleming were you most pleased to bring back? And is there anything from prior books or films that you weren't allowed to touch?
There was a few different things, but the starting seed for Hurricane Rim was this very throwaway line of dialogue in Moonraker where Bond and M are talking. And Bond says to M, "Oh, it was that time you attached me to the British Embassy in Moscow." And then he just moves on and we learn nothing more about it. And I thought that was such a fascinating idea, and it was interesting to me that Fleming had kind of left the door open and I wanted to step through it. And that's where the idea for Bond in his 20s in Moscow comes from. So I was pleased to sort of pick up on that little thread. And then there are other things. There's sort of structural similarities. So there's a chapter with Rachel Wolfe in New York, which is very much inspired by the short story 007 in New York. The journey across Russia is very much inspired by the end of You Only Live Twice and then The Man with the Golden Gun. I don't want to say too much, but I don't want to give spoilers, but if you've read those books, you can probably imagine the similarities. So I was always trying to write in dialogue with Fleming and pull on those threads. Things that I wasn't supposed to repeat from the films. There were a few ideas actually that I had for Double or Nothing that I was told, you can't do that and we can't tell you why. And then I watched No Time to Die and was like, oh, that's why. Okay. And I won't give spoilers, but those ideas, I felt like, okay, it's been enough time since No Time to Die and I would do them differently. So I sort of returned to them. I felt like it was, there's enough kind of mileage between me and that film. But for the most part, they're very free about referring to the world because, it would be a losing battle, and I think self-defeating to imagine that your audience hasn't seen every Bond film and read every Fleming novel. Mm-hmm. You've got that shared language with your audience, so why not speak it?
What was your approach to kind of incorporating current events? Charlie Higson on his novella got criticized, but it didn't bother me because, Fleming, it's 70 years ago and he's talking about, Suez Canal and Khrushchev and Kennedy and all this stuff. What was your own approach to that?
Absolutely. I think so. My approach was to follow in Fleming's footsteps. As you say, he wrote about the crises of his time. And I think that was why he was, or one of the reasons he was so popular, because he took things that felt incomprehensible and frightening, like the Cold War, and shrank them down to human scale. So instead of communism versus capitalism, we have Red Grant versus James Bond. And it feels comprehensible and it feels winnable because it's been shrunk down to that human scale. So I wanted to carry on with that, which is why I write about the climate crisis in Double or Nothing, which to me is the sort of big existential crisis of our time. But I also was drawing on sort of news stories, I suppose, that will feel real to people. So in A Spy Like Me, we have the Double O's tackling this smuggling network that's funding terror. And that was inspired by the looting of art and artifacts from Syria that funded the Charlie Hebdo terror attack. So these things are happening all around us, and they are kind of in our discourse, in our waking days, in our nightmares. And I think spy fiction is a way to open the topic and to talk about things that feel very difficult. So it was important to me to do that. It also kind of threw up some challenges because the world is changing very, very fast. So when I originally conceived of the trilogy, I thought that the main kind of issue that I would tackle in Hurricane Room, my plan, had been to base it around Brexit, which at this point feels like it happened a million years ago. So, events are moving so fast around me. Mm-hmm. And that's actually why there's the whole section in A Spy Like Me set in Afghanistan, which hadn't been in the original plan. But as I was writing it, NATO forces withdrew from Afghanistan and the Taliban retook the country. And that to me felt like it would be so important to Dryden, who had served there and had friends there and met the love of his life there. So it felt to me like for the character, we have to go there. It'd be kind of dishonest not to. So it's always a balancing act, I think, especially because you don't know how events will end.
Something I found curious this week playing First Light. In their Q lab, they have a quantum computer, which is very key to your trilogy as well. And since that game has been in development for the last 5 years, were you aware that they had something similar? And how did your iteration of Q come about?
No, I wasn't aware at all until somebody messaged me this week and said, "Oh, it's just like your book." My iteration came about because a few different things kind of fed into it. One was that Desmond Llewellyn gives such an iconic performance, and then Ben Whishaw came along, did the impossible, and made it his own. And I felt like I don't want to try and create another iteration that falls somewhere between the two or is compared to the two. Mm-hmm. So I thought, okay, well, I'll have a team then instead of it being one person. So what's the team based around? And then I can't resist a pun. So I thought, it'd be brilliant to bring in quantum, because of course we have Quantum of Solace. What if Q was a quantum computer? And that was a way into exploring how intelligence agencies today are using quantum computing and artificial intelligence to do things like crunch huge data sets when it comes to the financial funding of terrorism, for example. I found that really interesting, the kind of move away from human intelligence towards techno-espionage. So it was a way to embed that into the plot as well.
And modern technology it's so important to your trilogy. Like, how does that, as an author, how does that help and how much does that hinder your creative process?
In some ways, it's a hindrance because characters could technically call for help or convey information instantly anywhere in the world. And spy fiction is all, the sort of premise of spying and spy fiction is based around who knows what, when. And if everybody can know everything immediately, then your plot is going to be really, really short. So then you've got to build in barriers to that. But the technology itself presents barriers to that because it's in many ways not to be trusted. And there's a big sort of strand of Hurricane Room, which is about the dangers of relying on artificial intelligence when it comes to crunching the huge amounts of data that Five Eyes hoover up from all of us around the world. And the sort of plot of the novel revolves around the idea of this data being poisoned, there being bad blood in the data, how quickly disinformation can spread. So in a way, it's a barrier, but that barrier also provides you with a huge amount of creative material. And then for a character like Dryden, who, as I said, has lost part of his hearing because of this traumatic brain injury in Afghanistan, which is the most common injury for veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq. The technology is, in some ways, saving him from partial deafness. It's saving him from panic attacks. It's saving him from this din of noise. He's got this sort of neural implant that overcomes the hearing issue and connects him to Q at all times. But then that also causes this identity crisis because he's no longer, or feels he's no longer alone in his own mind, that he always has company, that he sort of has this ghost rattling around in his body. And that was really interesting to explore for his character across the arc of the 3 books.
Looking back on it with hindsight, is there anything you do differently, whether it be a minor thing or a big thing? Just, some people can be really introspective once a big project's done. But
it's interesting because there are things in the moment that I wished had unfolded differently. I think so. I've been writing these books, or these books have been in my life for 7 years, and there's been a huge amount of change in my life in that time. So we got married, we've moved house 5 times, we've bought a house, we've adopted a dog, and we've also had big losses. So lost my mother-in-law and my grandmother and my father. I'm pregnant. In about 3 weeks, I'm going to have a baby. So there's like a huge amount of change, and these books have sort of been my company during that change. And so there were times where I thought, God, I wish I wasn't on a deadline right now. I wish that I could put these down because life feels very intense. But I wouldn't go back and change that because then I wouldn't have written the books that I wrote. And in some ways, they were a saving grace for me in difficult times.
In other words, what happened in your life influenced you as a writer.
Yeah, exactly. And I can unpick that. Yeah.
There's a weird saying. It goes something like this. A fiction writer who thinks they are not showing off their inner being is like the blind stripper who thinks nobody can see her because she can't see herself. That's a little crass, but I think there's something to it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of that. And I remember my dad saying to me at one point, do you think anybody will be able to tell that you're going through this? This was towards the end of his life last year. He said, do you think anybody will be able to tell when they read the book? And I said, I don't really know. But I look at the book now and think, yes, every single page,
Well, and like I said earlier, you can sort of tell what was going on in Fleming's life in a general sense by the tone of the books and the way they take a turn around Goldfinger and become more darker later.
Yes, and I think people often forget that because they can read fantastically. You can read like fantasy, but actually it's really infused with Fleming's life. And I think when you're writing a novel, of course it's infused with your life. You're just not conscious of it. I think it takes a while. Afterwards, you get a bit of space from it and you realize, that's where that came from.
Well, as we wrap up, I actually did want to turn to the topic of mental health. And Bond is obviously put through the ringer here. So tell us about the balancing act between film and literary iterations and how much of Bond's psyche you're allowed to play with.
Yeah, it's interesting for a character who is known for one-liners and the raised eyebrow and being very funny. He's also a very bleak, often suicidal character. And that one character can encompass those two extremes, I find really interesting. When I started to write Hurricane Room, I actually began it in first person from Bond's perspective. That was my way to get into his voice. And then I gave a few chapters to the Flemings and they said, we actually have this rule that we never write Bond from the first person. And at first, I was kind of irritated because I liked my chapters. But then I thought about it a bit more. And I thought that's interesting that he is so unknowable. And why would that be? What barriers is he putting up as a character to try and stop people from knowing him? I thought about that amazing scene with Pierce Brosnan and Terry Hatcher, the hotel scene,
Yes.
where she says to him, "Did I get too close for comfort?" And he says, "Yes." And there's such heartbreak in that, yes. Why is it that he has to hold people at such arm's length? And that's something that was really the kind of driving question of Hurricane Room. Now that he's reunited with Harwood, can he trust her? Can he believe in her kind of vision of him? You know, she's very insistent, "I know who you are." But can he really believe in that? So that was a way for me to kind of examine this iconic character, to have him examine himself.
And resiliency is such a key theme, I feel like, for Hurricane Room, be it, Bond or Moneypenny, Felix, Dryden, Harwood, like they're all, it's such a key factor for all of those characters. And that's something that I really loved about the movie Skyfall was the resiliency of Bond. He's had everything stripped away. And at the end of the movie, he's just there staring out at that skyline, and he's still there. He's still the survivor.
Absolutely.
And you touched on, all the hardship that you've gone through personally. You even mentioned it in the afterword. Like, what kind of catharsis did you get at the completion of this? And do you see your own strengths coming through your writing in this book? Do you see your own resiliency?
Well, thank you. That's really lovely of you to see in the book. I think for me, the catharsis has really been this past week, publishing and releasing the book into the world. There were so many moments where I was finishing it, but feeling really up against it, like finishing the novel in spite of whatever else was going on. But this week has just been this real sense of release and relief and celebration. It's been incredible to see. We had a sold-out launch event at Waterstones Piccadilly, which is Europe's biggest bookshop. And to see so many people who I've met at all the different launches and met at the different Bond events, it really felt like a celebration and a chance to say thank you to everybody. Then I was down at Hay Festival, which is our kind of most significant literary festival. It takes place on the border between England and Wales, this really tiny village, but it draws 100,000 people. So it really feels like, I think Bill Clinton called it the Woodstock of the mind, which I don't know if that's a recommendation or not, but it feels that way. And doing the event there this week with Vaz Khan and Ava Glass, and Bond fans had come from far and wide, and it's not easy to get to. Just felt so kind of triumphant. Just felt like, wow, we did it, and it's out in the world, and I'm proud of it, which, there were lots of points while writing this book I didn't think that would be the case because of the circumstances under which I was writing it. But to kind of finish that event and then go and collapse in a deck chair with an ice cream as the sun set, that was a really nice moment.
Yeah. Not everyone makes it out of this series alive, but I found the ending to be just extremely satisfying, and I loved it so much.
Thank you.
And I could spend another hour talking to you, but I know you've got to get going. Is there anything that is coming down the pike for you? Obviously the baby, but beyond that, anything upcoming you want to tease or hint at?
So for me, the next few months will be becoming a mum. And then beyond that, something kind of exciting that's happened while I was writing Bond was a few screenwriting opportunities have come along, which I'm not really allowed to say any more about, but it's been very exciting to learn a new form of storytelling. And that will be carrying on. So I'm looking forward to a point where it's no longer a secret, and I can share that with everybody.
Well, excellent. Bill, did you have anything you'd like to add before we close out?
One thing very quickly, I mentioned about the similarities between Die Another Day and the Moonraker novel. Originally, they were going to use the name Gala Brand. And I think the script was in flux. And I think once Halle Berry was on board and was going to be the good girl, and they decided, no, we're not going to use Gala Brand as a bad girl. So,
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I remembered that after I mentioned it before. So,
yeah, and what a brilliant performance from her. I mean, she just totally lights up the screen. Amazing.
Well, the trilogy started off at a very interesting point in Bond fandom, because we just seen our hero die on the big screen, and then we start off with a new series of novels where there's no Bond, and I'm sure that probably got a lot of resistance from fans. But I hope that they give the trilogy a try, because it's so worthwhile. The journey that you take the reader on across these 3 books, it's engaging, it's thrilling, it's a lot of fun. It's cliched to say it's a page turner, but it really was. Like, once I started to get into it and put aside my preconceived notions of there's no Bond, like, there's so much deep characterization and I just fell in love with all the other characters, and I was sad to get to the end of it, because it is a trilogy, and that's kind of it. But hopefully return to the Bond universe in some fashion down the road, because we've seen Charlie Higson return, we've seen Raymond Benson return, so
yeah, there's very much a never say never again feeling, I think, to being a Bond author. It's a gig for life, which I love.
Well, Kim, I can't thank you enough for giving us your time so generously today, and for writing these books. I've got an autographed copy. It's supposed to arrive today from Portobello Bookshops, I think.
Yeah, going across the sea. Thank you.
It's very fitting that it's coming today, so I'm really excited to have 2 copies of the book now on my shelf.
That's lovely. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for such a lovely conversation. And you actually asked me a lot of questions, which nobody has asked me before.
Good.
Which after 5 years of doing this is really lovely. So thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for listening. On behalf of Kim Sherwood, thank you for joining us. And the 007 Files will return.